I'm Paul Bracken, and this is a talk called The Second Nuclear Age. I'm a professor at SOM, the School of Management, and I also teach in the Political Science Department, where I teach in Yale College, and I have a large lecture class, which actually used to be in here, but we got a little too big. Last time I offered this was 2 years. I sort of do it every other year. 2 years ago, we drew, I think, 240 students, and we hold it over in the Yale Law School auditorium. What I'd like to do today is kind of have a very informal chat about what's going on in the world. And it's like really very important. It gets a lot of attention from certain angles, but not from other perspectives, and it's those other perspectives. And let me not be mysterious about this. The perspective this subject of nuclear weapons is, we're going to be talking about nuclear weapons, not nuclear power, is how do you stop it? How do you stop the spread of nuclear weapons so that the problems I'm going to talk about don't happen? The perspective this subject is not usually looked at is the one I want to focus on today, which is what happens if you do not stop the spread of nuclear weapons? How can you live in a world where there's 9, 10, 15 nuclear powers? What is that world likely to be like? What are the problems? Is there anything we can do now? Let me say right off the bat that this is a subject that is much better to stop this from happening than to learn how to live with it. And that, in this sense, it's like the previous talk about cancer. But like cancer, you can't always stop it, and you have to learn how to live with it. So I think there are actually some similarities there. A good deal of what I'm going to be saying is I have a book that came out called The Second Nuclear Age. Paperback's going to be coming out in a month or so. But I'm going to be adding some new stuff. So even if you read that, it's going to be, let's bring it up to date, because a lot has happened in the past year, in my judgment, particularly on the U.S. reaction to what is going on in the world having to do with the spread of nuclear weapons. Okay, a good way to begin is to say that after the end of the Cold War, world leaders, almost all of them, and scholars and many other people foresaw a world where nuclear weapons could be eliminated or pushed into such background conditions where the major powers like the United States and Russia might keep a couple hundred of these things, but they wouldn't really have an active role in international affairs. It's my argument that this is a highly desirable state of affairs, a very good goal to have. I support it, but it has one defect, and that is it didn't happen. There are 9 nuclear weapon states today. Officially, there are the permanent 5 of the Security Council: U.S., Russia, China, France, and Britain. In addition, North Korea, India, Pakistan, and Israel have nuclear weapons. It is widely believed, including by me, that Iran has a very active nuclear weapon program. And so we have 9 of these things, probably going on 10. To our knowledge, there are no subnational groups that have nuclear weapons. That is to say, terrorist groups, thank God. But let me just go around the world quickly to give you sort of a composite picture, because one of the things I want to get across is that the world we're facing isn't just a situation where you have questions about how to deal with North Korea or how to deal with Iran. Should we take off some of the sanctions in exchange for letting them giving us access to inspect some of their nuclear weapons programs? In my view, that stuff is really down in the weeds. It's not going to have a big impact. It has a huge impact on the New York Times headlines and the Washington Post, but it probably isn't going to make that much difference. What is happening, and let's go from the Asia Pacific over to the Middle East. Okay, in the Asia Pacific region, you have North Korea today, and everything I'm saying now isn't things which might happen or could happen or hypotheticals. It has happened already. North Korea has about 15 nuclear weapons. It is building a very substantial uranium enrichment program, which we've known about since the 1990s. This means they're going to be able to significantly increase into the dozens, at least, the number of nuclear weapons that they have. Every year or so, they test a nuclear weapon to show the world that they have it, to show the United States that they have it. In April of this year, 2013, you may recall that there was a crisis as the rhetoric was getting out of control in North Korea. And one of the things that the U.S. did to respond to this crisis is quite interesting. We sent 2 B-2 bombers. These are B-2 stealth bombers out of Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, flew them with refueling over to South Korea, where they landed in a high-profile way. And the other thing we did at this time in April was to cancel a long-scheduled ICBM missile test out of Vandenberg, California, which shoots down range. Let me just explain. First of all, the B-2. The B-2 bomber, if you ask anybody in the armed forces today what's the most likely weapon the U.S. would use to fire a nuclear weapon, it would be the B-2 bomber. And we know that they have warheads for these things at Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri. The cancellation, and when the pilots landed, the media around the world focused on not, oh shucks, isn't it a nice pilot who's from Montana? What the media focused on was one thing, which is this is a nuclear-capable aircraft. This is something which clearly had to have had presidential release, permission to do this. The cancellation of the ICBM test launch, every 1 or 2 years the U.S. fires a test ICBM that is pulled from one of the missile squadrons where, I don't know if you saw the paper yesterday, that the head of this missile force was fired because of personnel security issues. He was relieved of command along with his deputy. We can get into this if you like. But these are long scheduled tests. Why did they cancel the test at the height of the Korean crisis in April? Reason, they did not want to look in Beijing like we were rattling the nuclear saber in the middle of a crisis over North Korea, because we did not want China to do the same thing to us in a future crisis involving the Senkaku Islands with the Japanese Navy, our U.S. Navy, and the Chinese Navy. As you know, there's a territorial dispute over islands there, and it would be highly provocative to test fire an ICBM. These have no warheads on it, obviously, in the middle of such a crisis. What do I take from this? What do I take from this is that, what I think you should take from this, this is an example of the U.S. engaging in communications and bargaining with other nuclear powers, China and North Korea, and that this kind of communication and bargaining is going to increase considerably in the future in what I call the second nuclear age. We don't want these things to happen, but we're going to have to get better at it. Just as a personal aside, I know many of the people in the administration, on the National Security Council, on the Secretary of Defense's staff, and they are of the view when they came into office that there's one thing you should never do, and that's rattle the nuclear saber. We want to signal to the world that these things have no value. That's what they felt in 2009. Here they are in 2013 doing exactly what President Kennedy, Nixon, and I will argue in a moment, every single Cold War president did, playing nuclear head games. Okay, China, briefly, we're going to sort of sweep around the world to just see what's going on and then try to put a picture together. China is on a massive military buildup involving its missile forces and other advanced technologies, including cyber war systems, including drones, including something you may not have heard about, but you will in the future, and that's called hypersonic missiles. A hypersonic missile is a really fast missile, as the name indicates. When I say fast, let me just make up some numbers which are approximate. If you fired one of these things from Hawaii down to near China, you're talking about a 13 or 14-minute flight time. All right. And what do you put on this missile? You can put anything you want, but coming in at 8,000 or 9,000 miles per hour, it doesn't really matter what you put on it, short of a nuclear warhead. So if this missile were coming in, and this is a U.S. aircraft carrier like Harry Truman, and there's 5 decks on the Truman, and this missile's coming in at 7,000 or 8,000 miles, it will punch right through the missile, every single deck, in an instant, causing a splatter that the simulations show you can't believe. It would utterly demolish the aircraft carrier's capability. China is now experimenting with these hypersonic missiles and having them queued up with drone aircraft and information warfare attacks. Let's go to India and Pakistan. India today has a triad of nuclear forces. That means intercontinental land-based missiles, bombers, which can carry nuclear warheads, and submarine-launched missiles aboard nuclear propulsion submarines. This is what the U.S. moved into in the 1960s. Okay, India is, why do they have these? All kinds of reasons, but they don't want any one leg of the triad to break down that Pakistan could hit them with. So if this sounds like we're reproducing parts of the Cold War, it's for the damn good reason that we are. If you look at Pakistan, Pakistan is one of the scariest places on earth. It doesn't get a lot of attention. Pakistan is on a plan to build hundreds of tactical short-range nuclear weapons, plutonium-based. We have the photographs of the plants at Kusab, and these are militarily run plants to generate plutonium, which is better for the small yield tactical nuclear warheads. Let's go around Iran's nuclear program. Don't want to spend a lot of time on the details because it's in the papers a lot, some of the particulars of it. But let me just give 1 or 2 examples of why we should be concerned. And the missile force of Iran has 2 parts. They have mobile missiles, and these are missiles that they put on very slow trucks. And when they're put on alert, they can drive around maybe at 10 miles an hour. But they go out into sites outside of Iran, and then they look for places to hide, like in an underpass. Okay. They also have fixed silo missiles, which just sit there, and these are non-nuclear, but they could be made nuclear. I'll say a moment about that. And what's the significance of these 2 different kinds of missiles? Well, it's my thinking that the first kind of missiles that sits in the second kind that sits in the silo, they can be launched on radar warning. And this can cover the alert, so to speak, of the mobile missiles. If you look at the Iranian missile posture, somebody has clearly thought this thing through in terms of putting it on alert in a very threatening way. You may read in the newspapers that sure, Iran or North Korea may have a nuclear weapon, but they haven't figured out how to put it on a missile yet. Okay, go back to 1945 and look at the data to 1950. What parameters of missiles improved most quickly in that era? And the answer is the shrinking of the physics package so that you could put it on a missile. That yield-to-weight ratio increased faster than any other parameter of missiles. It is not hard to do. I don't know where the physicists that these newspapers consult get their information. All right. Israel is shifting its nuclear deterrent from a land-based force of bombers and missiles to a sea-based force, combined force actually. Most Israeli nuclear warheads are down in the Negev desert, where they're down there because that's where Dimona is, and because there's not a lot of, when it was created, they don't want a lot of traffic and people taking pictures down there. But this force Israel can see that with a nuclear Iran with missiles is going to be vulnerable. And over a period of 5 to 10 years, Israel is shifting its nuclear warheads apparently to sea in a submarine-based program. So we have that. The French and the British have actually modernized their nuclear forces. The Russians have modernized their nuclear forces. There's one country in the world that has not done so in the past 20 years, that has gone out of its way not to do so, and that's the United States. And one of the arguments I'm going to make today is that that's probably going to change, and that there already is a shift in U.S. policy if you look behind the scenes in some of the statements that come out of the White House in particular. Okay, how should we think about this? My view is that what is going on is we have entered a second nuclear age. The first nuclear age was the Cold War. It started in 1945 if you're really conspiratorial, or in 1948 if you're just an ordinary Cold War historian, with the Berlin crisis. And it ended in 1991 because that's when the Soviet Union finished its existence. If we look at this first nuclear age, we can look at some of the dynamics and ask the following question. What are the lessons of the first nuclear age, the Cold War? And we could have a list saying, well, these do or do not apply to a second nuclear age. Second nuclear age I will define here to be the spread of the bomb for reasons that have nothing to do with the Cold War. Okay? It comes after the Cold War, but in some cases it doesn't come after the Cold War, because we now know that in the nuclear programs of China and Israel, that they used the Cold War as a mask to do something they wanted to do anyway, which is to get the bomb. China wanted to do it to declare independence from the old Soviet Union. Okay, what are some of the lessons of the first nuclear age? Now, I would defy you to find a book that summarizes what these are. Most books and accounts in the academic world of the Cold War, what are the lessons of the Cold War, come up with such profound insights as, well, lesson number one, do not get into a thermonuclear war that kills 50 to 100 million people. Is there anybody in here who would disagree with that, who thinks that it's good to get into a nuclear war? Okay? Second lesson is don't get into a military showdown which could escalate. Don't get into a Cuban Missile Crisis, because you'll get into a war that could kill 50 to 100 million people. Who in here is in favor of getting into nuclear crises which would erupt? I gave this talk at Los Alamos in the summer, and there was actually 2 hands that went up. I had to ask them to leave the room. I don't know what the hell they were thinking, but it doesn't seem to make any sense to want to get into a nuclear crisis. All right, so I don't think there's any good lessons learned of the Cold War, so I took my attempt to do so in this book, and let me give you a couple of them. And the first one, by far the most important lesson about nuclear weapons in the Cold War, is you don't have to fire a nuclear weapon to use it. Most of the effects of nuclear weapons in the Cold War had absolutely nothing to do with nuclear war. In fact, I'll say it more strongly. I still cannot find a Cold War history book which makes the following true point. At no point in the Cold War did either side ever seriously consider a calculated strike on the other. Okay. But they sure as hell used nuclear weapons. They used nuclear weapons for deterrence. They used them for communications and bargaining. The United States used them to pry Soviet missiles out of Cuba during the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. The Russians used the deployment of nuclear weapons in Europe to raise political mischief in NATO, to try to split the liberal versus the conservative political parties aside. 1969 is another example of using nuclear weapons, what I call in the book nuclear head games. And this is trying to create illusory ideas of what you might do with nuclear weapons if the other side doesn't conform to certain behaviors. And I'm going to just give one example of a nuclear head game from Richard Nixon The point I want to make here is every single Cold War president, from Harry Truman to George Bush 41, the elder Bush, every single one, liberal, conservative, Republican, Democrat, hawk, dove, all of them played nuclear head games. Some of the most intense head games were played by Jimmy Carter, who authorized very provocative operations against Soviet submarines. And again, the backdrop, just to, so we don't get lost in the arguments here, is lessons of the first nuclear war, which are going to play out in a second nuclear age as well. So in 1969, the U.S. is involved in Vietnam, wants to get out of this war desperately. President Nixon orders SAC, Strategic Air Command, to go on heightened levels of alert. The Soviets pick this up. What is going on? What Nixon wanted was to have Moscow pressure Hanoi into accepting peace terms which Hanoi did not want to accept. A feature of nuclear head games I want to emphasize here, and I've researched a lot of cases, is this is played by a political elite and they may not tell the military. In the 1969 case, SAC at Offutt Air Force Base picks up the phone and calls the President's Assistant for National Security Affairs. I don't want to give his name, but he has a thick German accent, and you've heard of him. And says, what are you trying to do? Because if you told us what you wanted to do, we could help you and do it better. And this unnamed official in the White House says, if the White House wants your advice, we'll ask for it. Shut up and follow orders. So you have these political leaderships playing these nuclear head games. Okay? All right, so these are like some of the lessons of the first nuclear age, which I will argue do apply. Let me just point out one, how it has already applied. It's 2007. The Israelis are in a dust-up with Iran over Iran's, sort of the rhetoric was unchanged from 2007 to today. And they go to President Mubarak, who's still in charge in Egypt, and they say, do we have permission to put a Israeli Dolphin-class submarine through the canal, through the Suez Canal? All right. Now, Egypt is supposed to side with the Islamic countries. Iran is Islamic, so is Egypt. It doesn't do that. It gives Israeli nuclear weapon submarines permission to use the Suez Canal. It is a nuclear head game to tell Tehran where Egypt, headed by Mubarak, lives on this particular issue. All right, so these are some of the sort of dynamics of the first nuclear age which go over. Let me talk about a different subject, which is what are the dynamics of a second nuclear age that probably have no counterpart in the Cold War, but we're going to see now. So what is distinctive about the second nuclear age, this spread of the bomb after the Cold War? I think the most significant feature of this era is the fact that it's a multipolar nuclear world. There's several countries with the bomb. And this introduces all kinds of dynamics, such as, let me just give you a couple. We could go at the 30,000-foot theoretical political science level, or we could go to the sort of street level. Let's go to the street level for some examples here. The U.S. wants to deploy something called prompt global strike. What is this? This is a missile we would put on U.S. submarines with a conventional warhead, and it could dig out bunkers in Iran or North Korea. So the warhead goes down, and then it has a conventional explosive. China looks at this and say, well, that's all well and good about North Korea, but what about us? This means the United States could be threatening our nuclear forces, and we don't like that. Moreover, Mr. United States, you're also talking about providing missile defense to South Korea and Japan to protect them from a North Korean attack. This means that if we wanted to use our nuclear weapons against Japan, of course we would never do that, never consider that, but if we did consider that, you could shoot them down. Therefore, we don't want you to do those things. Therefore, we are going to build up our forces to counter what you are doing. And that's really what's going on now as China deploys a very large number of missiles whose warheads we don't know whether they're conventional or nuclear. More, the drones and the hypersonic missiles that China is developing, as are the United States. I mean, we're in an arms race now with China. The systems that they're developing are such that it raises the risk to the U.S. Navy to go within 1,000 miles of the Chinese coast. So in a number of war games that I have played in the Department of Defense, what happens in these games is the person playing president says, look, China, we don't really like what they're doing, but it isn't like the old Soviet Union. I don't want to get into a war inadvertently. Don't put the fleet west of Hawaii. Hold the U.S. fleet back. What this triggers is all kinds of reactions in South Korea and Japan as they figure out that they're on their own. Okay. So what's going on here is China, you got North Korea, South Korea, Japan, the United States. They can't really converge and figure all out what the clear strategies for stability are, frankly, because a lot of them don't want stability. Another big difference between the first nuclear age and the second nuclear age is the ideology which drives this thing. Cold War was driven by a belief in liberty and democracy on our part. Let's accept the undergraduate version of this course, at least for a minute. And the statist totalitarian views of the Soviet Union. What is the ideological drivers of the world we are in today? And I would say the biggest ideological driver is nationalism, which has replaced this ideological construct from the Cold War. Nationalism is the fictitious belief that one people is superior to another. And what's interesting is that it played very little role in nuclear crises in the Cold War. If you go back to the Cuban Missile Crisis, Berlin crises, whatever, in no instance did either power try to put 1 million people into Times Square or Red Square to scream for the blood of the Untermenschen, the blood of the other side, which a leader could have said will make my bargaining position stronger. Kennedy didn't do that, Johnson didn't do that, Khrushchev didn't do that, Brezhnev didn't do that. Why? Because it was too damned dangerous. It could back them into a corner that they couldn't get out of later on. When it came to nuclear showdowns, both sides approached it with this kind of distant, antiseptic, icy rationality characteristic of game theory of a kind that Tom Schelling won a Nobel Prize for in 2005. It was drawing curves of decreasing marginal utility as a function of how many nuclear weapons you had, as far as possible from the street, unleashing the emotions of the street. Well, that is going to change considerably, I think, in the second nuclear age. Okay, I would say another really big difference in the second world we're going into now comes under, it's really a fascinating thing, because if you look at international politics, it has certain cycles and intensities, and then there's technological dynamics, and they have their own intensities and dynamics, and they may or may not have anything to do with the politics. We are in now a revolution in military affairs. Military technology is changing as dramatically as it ever did in the 1950s. And I've mentioned these before. Drones, which can target systems. You put them out there and they're hard to see because they're small, and you can take pictures and send back signals intelligence. Makes a huge difference. Stealth can penetrate deeply into a country before it's detected. These precision strike systems are very important. Hypersonic missiles. What does all this mean? What it means is, For the first time since the 1980s, you can write a plausible scenario for a first strike by one country on another where the country shooting first uses only conventional weapons to take out the nuclear deterrent of the other side. In the Cold War, if you were going to disarm the Soviet Union or they were going to disarm us, you had to fire nuclear weapons. There were daunting reasons not to do that. We didn't know how these things would operate. We never tested any nuclear weapons under realistic conditions. The missiles that I mentioned that were tested, that were shot out of Vandenberg, or the test was actually canceled. When was the last time the U.S. fired a real missile from a real silo in Wyoming or Montana? I doubt anybody in here knows, but the answer is 1967. We fired 2 test missiles in 1967. And by the way, both of them failed to launch. Okay? So the new technologies are not just becoming more destabilizing, you can test them under field conditions. And when Pakistan objects strenuously to the what's the correct word? The targeting of Osama bin Laden, what they're objecting to is the U.S. deploying an array of technologies, stealth, intelligence, cyber attack, stealthy helicopters, to combine in a first strike, and they didn't know about it. What they're really concerned about is that either India or the United States will use these technologies to go after their nuclear forces. If you read the accounts in the New York Times about the drone controversy, one of the interesting features is that the agreement signed between Pakistan's intelligence service, ISI, and the CIA is no-fly zones over certain regions of Pakistan, where we will not fly drones over certain regions of the country. That's where they keep their nuclear weapons. Okay. So there's a number of things going on in the world which make it very limiting to look at this world as a sequence of individual bilateral standoffs, such as U.S. versus North Korea, Israel versus Iran. There's a much bigger interconnected picture that's emerging. What can we do about these things? I think there's actually a lot, because we haven't thought about this in so long, since back to the Cold War. Let me just give some ideas out onto the table that I think would be improvements in understanding of the world we're going into. And one is to refashion arms control. Arms control was used extensively in the Cold War, and basically what people did is to take the legacy Cold War arms control treaties and just carry them into the 21st century. Prominent examples of this would be START, the Strategic Arms Reduction talks. And in 2010 or 11, the U.S. signed another agreement with Russia. This is a bilateral, 2 countries sign it, to reduce the number of missiles. Well, they're going to go down from, it doesn't really matter because there's more than enough to go around, but from about 1,500, they want to go down to about 1,100. Now, what is START about? START goes back to the old SALT talks of 1969, where each side was afraid of a strike by the other side. The capacity to do that today with these untested systems is, in my view, so remote a possibility that we're solving a problem that doesn't exist. The chance that the Russians are going to one day do some calculations with their operations research people and say, aha, we have an ability to take out the U.S. nuclear forces now, is, I would say, lower. I mean, an attack from the Martian invaders is a higher probability, in my view. If you ask me if I'm in favor of START, I guess I would pause and say, sure, why not? It doesn't do much harm. But it distracts attention from the major problem, which is now in the regions. The problem, believe me, is Israel, Iran, Pakistan, North Korea. That's what we have to focus on. And that's the problem that the Non-Proliferation Treaty the other great Cold War treaty from 1968 is not doing a good job on, because it's easy to cheat. Why is it easy to cheat? Because the Non-Proliferation Treaty was designed for a technological world of 1975. In 1975, Pakistan did manufacture bicycles, but Pakistan did not have the engineering capability to do the chains for the bicycles, so they had to import them. It is a technologically obsolescent treaty because many countries now, if they really want to get a nuclear weapon, they can do so. Now, don't get me wrong, I am very much in favor of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But we need to do something else. What does the something else look like? A couple of ideas. Number one, the United States declares no first use of nuclear weapons. We, the United States, will not be the first to use nuclear weapons under any circumstances whatsoever, period, end of paragraph. Now, if you do read the book, I have a controversial addendum to that, and it's called No First Use, Guaranteed Second Use. Whereas if anybody else does use nuclear weapons, the U.S. will take it on itself to punish the country that does that with nuclear strikes against them, without distinguishing whether this is an ally or an opponent or a neutral. Now, I hope you will appreciate that when I gave this talk in Tel Aviv a year ago, they didn't really like this idea all that much. I don't know why, who can figure? And what I really want to do here is provoke discussion and deeper thinking about this. I want to increase the recognition that the major powers have lost their monopoly control over nuclear weapons, as North Korea, Pakistan, Israel, etc., get these things. And they'd better start recognizing how to keep a war or a crisis in the region. One of the things I see emerging is what I would call a great power arms control system in which China, the US, Russia, and India have a disproportionate say in who gets to do what. Because I think they do have a shared interest in not having these regions go nuclear. Russia or China does not want a nuclear Iran. They simply can't. It would be insane for them to do so. A couple of other thoughts. We need to raise the level of conversation about these issues. You would be shocked at the low level of discussion to which this whole field has degenerated. This was a lively field, for better and worse, in the Cold War, with lunatics on the left and lunatics on the right. Today, it has shrunk to a pale academic debate that has no impact whatsoever on the policies of the United States government or any other government. It is a self-referential academic debate. We need to have new thought leadership in this field of a kind that has come about before, back in the Cold War. If you were to go back to the early 1950s, the thought leadership in this field was dominated by the physicists. Well into the sort of the late 50s, and then the Rand Corporation with new frameworks comes in, and they get to define the problems. Today, what's striking to me is how few people in the scientific and engineering community play any role in the discussions and debate on these matters. But the fact that, like when I was young and starting out, that I worked at a place where it was routine to have Ed Teller, Hans Bethe, or Freeman Dyson come by for lunch and talk about these things, gave this whole subject a seriousness which I think it has almost completely lost. All right. Now, these academic debates, they're fine and they're highly contested, but they're not having any impact on the thinking in Washington, D.C. My own personal view of why they fired these generals in the past few days is because nuclear weapons are taken to be so unserious and unimportant now by the Air Force, the Army, and the Navy that they can't even do the small things like move a nuclear weapon around safely. I work on an advisory panel for the Chief of Naval Operations. And a few years ago, the Air Force moved live hydrogen bombs from Minot Air Force Base, flew them down to Barksdale in Louisiana, and they didn't take the warhead off of the cruise missile, which you're really supposed to do if you're flying over populated areas. I will just say that, having worked this problem for the Navy came up with, the Navy could have suffered the same fate as the Air Force. The Navy was not taking this stuff seriously. When Secretary of Defense Jim Schlesinger was asked to review these matters, he was told, what his conclusion was, just what I said, that they can't even move these things around safely. This isn't bad management in the field, although it is. It's that the people in the field are getting signals from the top that nuclear weapons don't matter anymore. Okay, just in sum, and then we'll just get maybe 15 minutes of questions. We are in a second nuclear age, and I think this is a world, it's sort of like Einstein's field equations. It changes the geometry of international politics. The mere existence of nuclear weapons, not the firing of nuclear weapons, induces dramatic changes in countries' behavior. U.S. is going to be a lot more cautious in dealing with China, and I could go through different avenues. If you look at Israel, Iran, there's all kinds of things Iran can do to make life in Israel intolerable, and they do not involve firing any nuclear weapons or any weapons of any kind at Israel. And finally, the thinking on this has really fallen so low in the discourse on public policy that it needs to be changed and raised simply for reasons of minimizing the danger. So let me see if you have any comments or questions or particular avenues you want to take this. There's a mic. We could do a civil defense exercise now and duck under the chair. Some of you may feel like doing that. Sure.
Well, I certainly haven't been optimistic. Just a couple of comments. As one who at various times has worked with both David Keller and Admiral Rickover. Two things. One, the mutually, I like your policy of no first use and guaranteed second use. I think it's kind of the modern equivalent of mutually assured destruction, which I think kept the peace in the Cold War, more than any other item. And in particular, I think Admiral Rickover's insistence on a nuclear leg of a naval leg of the triad is what tipped the bill. The other thing that concerns me is the point you made about the lack of influence of the scientists, which is a reflection of what I think is a national disaster, namely the degradation of science in particular and fact in general in our political debate. I'm not alone in this. My advisor, right. Alan Bromley, whose right. lab I did my PhD in, wrote a scathing editorial about, having served in Bush 1's, as Bush 1's science advisor, wrote a scathing editorial called, Eating Our Feed Corn, about the lack of interest in science reflected in the government since. And I think this is a problem that we're all going to reap the disastrous right. results of this degradation and diminution of the role of science in our national life. That's not really the question.
I think everybody heard it. I would basically agree. And Alan Bromley is, of course, Yale's Alan Bromley that worked in the administration. And I had many conversations with him and things about these kinds of matters. Others share this concern. I was at Los Alamos at the 70th anniversary of Los Alamos' founding in the summer, and the head of the American Physical Society was there. And he was very much struck by, I have a connection to political science academically, but the way they do social science is just very different from the way a scientist or engineer would. Let's just leave it at that without throwing stones at anybody. The regressions that they use to prove things would not be used to see if a bridge was going to stay standing. Sure.
Yeah, Paul, thanks. I guess my question, and one difference between the second nuclear age and the first, is that if you look at the first nuclear age, at the point when at the point that after the United States obviously became a nuclear power, and you had various other countries acquiring nuclear weapon status, whether that was Russia, China, Britain, France, there certainly was never any sort of diplomatic effort made to try to persuade one of those countries to voluntarily surrender their existing nuclear arsenal. Right? It was just accepted that after you had crossed the threshold that you were in fact a nuclear power. So I guess my question in thinking about North Korea, which obviously has an arsenal, and in the case of the Iranians, who are nuclear ready, it happens to be I guess the question is whether or not I guess a major reason that we are diplomatically really struggling with this issue is because we actually don't have a paradigm from the past which actually works.
At least yet. Let me put it a little bit differently. Historians have this argument that the timing of different eras matters. The fact that the second nuclear age comes after the first means that the major powers from the Cold War could, in theory, or could try to slow this down or prevent it. And they very much are. I mean, they're doing. You can't point to an American policy of the past 60 years that has more widespread support across the political spectrum or more dollars thrown at it than nuclear nonproliferation. And I don't view it as a total failure. I have complicated views on it. But we should do everything we can to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons to these other countries. I will add that if a major power wants to get nuclear weapons, think Japan, there's nothing we can do about that. And two, I don't think it's going to be that bad. I would much rather have a nuclear Japan than a nuclear North Korea. So this is, you can't measure how good you're doing by the number of countries with nuclear weapons. We've got to change the measure of effectiveness. This is something I learned from Professor DiNardo, to what your objective is, and here it is to lower the chance of one of these things going off. Okay, so focusing on this as a regional problem, like I would like to get into the vocabulary and thinking of diplomacy. A nuclear crisis in a region stays in the region. Because what I don't want to happen is for a dust up with North Korea to have China go on alert and sort of back North Korea because the U.S. is coming in. We should separate these things out. I think there's a lot of creative opportunity for new policies in this era. I think the existing arms control community hasn't had a new idea in 20 years. Yet they get huge amounts of foundation funding to just do something which worked well for the 70s. Sure.
How would guaranteed second use work for a non-state body like Al-Qaeda?
Yeah, the question was how guaranteed second use against Al-Qaeda. I don't think it's needed to use nuclear weapons against Al-Qaeda. There already is. Groups like that, subnational groups, are already treated like pirates were in the 19th and 18th century. Anybody can go after a pirate and kill them, capture them. And that's the world we're in now, and that is going on. it would be better if other major powers, Russia and China, perhaps India, would take on the responsibility. We didn't get into this because one of the other big problems in this second nuclear age is all of the policies seem to require that the weight of the effort and the risk falls on one country, the United States. Okay. I gave a talk to Indian parliamentarians here at Yale. We have an agreement that it's like their senators come over. It was very interesting. I spent a morning with them in May this year. And we gave them the book, and we were talking about arms control. And what I said to them was the most useful thing you could do for arms control is start making arms control proposals. And they said, well, what do you mean? Which proposals should we make? My response is, I don't care what they are. Just start making some proposals that will force the Pentagon and the State Department to respond to them. Because the problem today is all of the arms control initiatives come from the United States, and they looked one-sided. Arms control, in my view, will become globalized. All right. I think if we continue to be the only power that takes on this responsibility, we are in a very dangerous situation. I mean, just look at the U.S.-China relationship today. There's an arms race going on. China is responding by building conventional and nuclear forces. We are still pretending that you can attack this problem only with conventional forces. When they say in the debate with respect to Iran that all options are on the table, let me assure you, all options are not on the table. Much of Iran policy as it's formulated in Washington, D.C. today is really designed to keep certain options as far away from the table as is possible. Number one, a new nuclear warhead for U.S. forces. Two, a new nuclear force, one that could be used. The nuclear forces the U.S. possesses today are like junk in the attic. No president in his right mind would ever fire these things. You don't know what's going to happen. The collateral damage, smallest Minuteman warhead is 340 kilotons. Can you believe that? How could you possibly use that? It's sucking up the modernization budget for the U.S. strategic forces over the next 10 years is literally $1 trillion. To deter a Russian surprise attack on U.S. missiles. It is a world that has developed its own logic among a small number of people that is increasingly being challenged by different viewpoints. So, sure.
I was kind of curious when you look at the political science community of Russia, since they were, it was us and them, in the first Cold War. What their view is on these nationalist, countries popping up, and particularly in the Middle East.
The social science community in Russia was basically destroyed by the communist rule. Not destroyed in the sense of thrown into jail, but so corrupted by the powers that be that it really doesn't exist in any sort of policy impact form today. If you go to meetings in Moscow or St. Petersburg or they come here, they will readily admit that they do not want a nuclear Iran and they're not too happy about a nuclear North Korea. But it has so far yet not moved them off the mark. I think if you think about this, it's interesting. The U.S. doesn't want to change this in a certain respect. Why? Because American presidents love this image of going to Moscow, signing a big, thick book called Arms Control, and toasting vodka in these little glasses and clinking, and being responsible for world order. If we felt that we really needed to bring in other countries, it would detract from the sole superpower image. That's why the June 19th President Obama speech in Berlin is really interesting, because when he issued it, President Obama gave a speech in April of 2009 saying the world's going to become nuclear free. All right, the famous Prague speech. June 19th this year, he issues another speech in Berlin on the START talks and nuclear weapons, And the White House press office puts out a communique on U.S. nuclear strategy. And for the first time in history, I maintain, they included China in this white paper. And this is, they've never, because they always refused, they always said China was too small to worry about. This is a tentative acceptance of a multipolar nuclear world. And I think it's quite significant. Most of my conservative friends really just are so upset over the global zero, let's get rid of nuclear weapons, that they don't see this fine distinction that I have seen, but I think they're wrong. I believe it's quite significant. Sure.
Do you think there's any value in arms reduction between the U.S. and Russia? Any value towards non-proliferation? I always thought there was, but you seem to suggest that there isn't.
I'm not sure. Just unpack it or rephrase it.
Is there value in arms reduction between U.S. and Russia towards non-proliferation of nuclear weapons? Sending a signal to other countries, the big countries are giving up many of their nuclear weapons.
Okay,
so
all right.
let me just to develop.
I get it. Yeah, for years the Non-Proliferation Treaty said the major powers, the U.S. and Russia, would get rid of their arsenals. We never did, and so these reduction talks could be used as a signal to other countries and to legitimize more pressure on North Korea for the same reason. That, see, we are reducing our nuclear forces as well. And I think that does have value. I would say very much it does have value. But you still don't have a force that you can actually use. And this belief that this is going to have much of an effect on North Korea, it's hard for me to accept. But I would very much be in favor, because all other things being equal, fewer nuclear weapons are better. I would point out that the way to do this is the hard way they're going about it, which is with a treaty that goes through the Senate. What president reduced nuclear weapons more than any other in American history? Anybody know? George Bush, 41, the elder. And you know how he did it? He sent a one-page memorandum to the Pentagon saying, get rid of these weapons and forget about negotiating the reduction with the Russians. Forget about taking it to Congress. He just ordered a unilateral reduction. And the fact that nobody even in here knows that he did it shows the skill of the policy execution. If he had taken that to the Senate, he would have been attacked from the left and the right and every other which way.
I'm trying to just maybe squeeze in a little bit of optimism into this. I was wondering if, we don't really know all the backroom details, but it appears that one way or another, we convinced the Russians that it was in their national best interest to oppose, agree with elimination of Syria's chemical weapons. And I'm wondering if you see other opportunities for us to work covertly or whatever with the Chinese to put similar pressure on North Korea, or China and Russia to put more pressure on Iran, or some sort of multilateral approach that might offer better hope than a unilateral denunciation by the United States.
No, I think that's exactly right. I think the chemical agreement still a breaking story, but even if it falls apart, you have Moscow and Washington agreeing about certain things. All right. So I think this is an example of what is going to happen. Now, this makes these smaller countries extremely nervous because it looks like Moscow and Washington establishing a condominium to rule the Middle East. And they should be, all right? But when it comes to nuclear weapons, I am in favor of this condominium. Okay. I think others may have to join it, major powers. I'm never going to legitimize the North Korean, Pakistani. The Israeli arsenal is complicated, but what isn't? Eric?
The thing that bothered me, worries me about your book and also about your talk
Yeah. Let me just repeat Eric's question. Eric Denoider, professor of operations research here, and my former professor. He points out that the level of engagement, of fear and emotional involvement with these issues, which was a crazy part of the Cold War, like duck and cover civil defense drills, all right, but it really got you engaged with these issues. Now, there is no such engagement. So we need to find methodologies that increase the engagement and, I would argue, broaden the audience beyond the specialists who do it now. And the answer, I think, is a very powerful one, is with gaming, role-playing simulations. And there's been a revolution in gaming under the name, I mean, it's a pedantic buzzword now, but it's called gamification. Exemplified in things like NFL, fantasy football, and other things. But this kind of methodology really should be investigated for these purposes. The idea of the political science views of deterrence and nuclear weapons are very much top-down axiomatic, and once you go down 7 layers, then people apply it to North Korea and Pakistan. But it loses all emotional involvement with the subject, which I really think is critical. One last question, maybe?
Just a comment. I just came from talk on emotional intelligence.
Okay. Right. It's Mark, but that's right.
Bracken. Anyway, and he's working with game companies to develop games to improve emotional.
In schools, yeah.
Yeah, but not just in schools.
Yeah, right.
And I think maybe you guys ought to get together.
No, Mark is a friend of mine, and
Way to get emotional
right.
intelligence improved in the diplomatic.
Yeah, we have a psych professor who does gaming for educational purposes, and this is not your grandfather's father's gaming, but you can marry up the two, and it has a lot of potential, I think. Thank you very much for coming out. It's a beautiful day.